Mrs. Zelda Inovov's silk nightgown rustled as she stood trembling over her husband's lifeless body. Phone pressed to her ear with perfectly manicured nails. 5 staff members crowded the bedroom doorway, watching their boss lie pale and motionless on king-size sheets. The personal nurse confirmed what everyone could see. No pulse, no breath, nothing. "Please, send someone immediately." Zelda sobbed into the phone, her voice cracking with practiced grief. "My husband, Tony Gonzalo, he's gone. I just found him." "Ma'am." The word cut through the manufactured sorrow like a blade. Every head turned toward Pamela Frey, the head maid, whose dark eyes blazed with something between fury and vindication. "You don't need to call anyone." Zelda's mask slipped just for a heartbeat shock, morphing into rage. "Excuse me?" The nurse just confirmed. "He's not dead." The phone slipped from Zelda's fingers as heavy footsteps thundered up the marble stairs, badges flashing in doorways, and on the bed behind her, Tony Gonzalo's finger twitched. Let's rewind. To understand how a maid took down a mafia queen, you need to understand something about family. Sometimes it's not about blood. Sometimes it's about who stays when staying is dangerous. This is the story of how 2 lonely people saved each other, and how love, not violence, became the deadliest weapon of all. 10 years earlier, Pamela Frey stood outside the towering Gonzalo estate gates in rain that felt personal, like the universe was taking one last shot at her before she either made it or didn't. 3 garbage bags containing everything she owned sat at her feet, already soaking through. 22 years old, no references worth mentioning, and a background that would make most employers slam doors in her face. This housekeeping job was her last chance before the streets became her only option. The woman at the employment agency had delivered the warning with the enthusiasm of someone describing a dental procedure. "Mr. Gonzalo doesn't do warm and fuzzy. He barely speaks to staff, works around the clock, keeps to himself, and for God's sake, don't ask personal questions. Half the girls we send don't last a week." Pamela nodded like she cared. She didn't. She needed money and a place to disappear, preferably somewhere her uncle's family would never think to look for her. The gate buzzed open without ceremony. No welcome, no escort, just an impersonal click that said you're expected, don't waste time. Pamela dragged her soggy bags up a driveway that seemed designed to intimidate, past fountains and sculpted hedges that screamed money in ways her uncle's modest house never could. The front door opened before she reached it, revealing a stern-faced woman in her 50s who looked Pamela up and down with the warmth of a prison guard. "You're late. The bus." "Mr. Gonzalo doesn't care about buses. He's in his study. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't touch anything. And don't expect chit-chat." The woman, the outgoing head of staff, Pamela would learn, turned on her heel. "Follow me." The study felt more like a mausoleum than an office. Dark wood, heavy curtains, the kind of furniture that cost more than Pamela had earned in her entire life. And behind an enormous desk sat Tony Gonzalo, 35 years old and already legendary in circles Pamela knew existed but had never touched. He didn't look up when she entered, just kept signing documents with mechanical precision. "Sit." Pamela sat. The outgoing staff member disappeared without another word, and suddenly it was just her and a man whose reputation preceded him like a thunderstorm. When Tony finally looked up, his eyes were the coldest thing she'd ever seen. Not cruel, just empty, like someone had scooped out everything warm and left only function. "You understand the position requires discretion." It wasn't a question. What happens in this house stays in this house. You see nothing, you say nothing. Your job is to maintain the household, not to form opinions about what you observe. Clear? "Yes, sir." "You'll work 6 days a week. Room and board included. Salary deposited bi-weekly. I don't tolerate gossip, theft, or incompetence. You have questions?" Pamela had 1,000 questions, but the woman at the agency's warning echoed in her head. "No, sir." Tony returned to his paperwork, and Pamela thought the interview was over until he spoke again, softer this time. "The previous staff member said you have no family references, no emergency contacts listed." "No, sir." He looked up again, and for just a second, something flickered behind those empty eyes, recognition, maybe, or understanding. "You'll start tomorrow. Mrs. Chen will show you to your quarters." He paused, hand hovering over the next document. "There's a dog, Bruno, German Shepherd. He's the only one here who actually likes people. Don't let that fool you into thinking I do." Pamela noticed details others might miss. The photos on his desk were all of buildings, no people. There was a dog bed in the corner, but no dog visible. His hands shook slightly when he poured water from a crystal decanter. And suddenly, with the clarity of someone who'd spent years being unwanted, she understood. He's lonely, bone deep, decades-old lonely, just like her. 3 months passed in a blur of routine. Pamela kept her head down, did her job immaculately, saved every penny like her life depended on it because it did. She observed Tony's patterns with the attention of someone who'd learned early that survival meant reading the room. He worked 18-hour days, 8 meals alone at a dining table built for 12. Never had visitors except business associates who left looking terrified. His German shepherd, Bruno, was his only real companion, and Bruno, she noticed with dark humor, had significantly better social skills than his owner. The dog loved everyone: delivery people, gardeners, the weekly cleaning crew. But with Tony, Bruno was different. Protective, devoted, like he understood his owner needed someone to choose him unconditionally. Pamela related. One evening, insomnia drove her downstairs at 2 a.m. for water, and she found Tony sitting in the kitchen, staring at a birthday cake with a single candle burning down to nothing. He'd apparently ordered it for himself and forgotten about it. The scene was so utterly pathetic, this powerful man alone on his birthday with store-bought cake, that Pamela broke her own rule about staying invisible. Want some company? Tony's instinct was clearly to refuse. His mouth opened to deliver what was probably a polite dismissal. But something in her voice, maybe the recognition of shared damage, maybe just exhaustion with pretending loneliness, was a choice made him gesture to the chair across from him. They didn't talk about anything important. The cake was stale. The coffee she made was terrible. But they sat together in that dark kitchen, 2 unwanted people sharing a forgotten birthday, and something shifted. Not friendship, not yet. Just the acknowledgement that maybe being alone didn't have to mean being lonely. Over the following months, a routine developed. Pamela brought Tony coffee in the mornings, and they shared exactly 7 minutes of conversation before his first meeting. She learned he grew up in foster care after his parents were eliminated in a business dispute. His words, delivered with the emotion of someone reading a grocery list. He learned she was saving for a bakery, something that made her eyes light up in a way that seemed almost painful for him to witness. "Why don't you have family?" he asked once, and she answered simply, "Same reason you don't. Nobody wanted us." It was the most honest conversation either had had in years, maybe ever. By year 3, Pamela had been promoted to head of household staff, managing a team of 6 and handling Tony's personal schedule with efficiency that made his business associates jealous. By year 5, she was attending his business dinners, standing in corners like a silent guardian, reading situations and warning him with subtle signals when someone was lying or dangerous or both. Bruno started sleeping outside her bedroom door, like the dog had decided she was pack now, worth protecting. They never said the words Tony didn't do vulnerable, and Pamela didn't trust promises, but they'd become family. The father-daughter relationship neither dared to hope for, built on morning coffee and late-night conversations, and the profound relief of being chosen by someone when the world had spent years making you feel disposable. Then one evening, Tony found her reviewing household budgets in the kitchen and said something that made her coffee taste suddenly bitter. "I met someone." Pamela looked up, waiting for the punchline. Tony didn't meet people. He did business transactions and territorial negotiations and occasional necessary social appearances, but he didn't meet people in the way his tone implied. "Her name is Zelda Inovov. She's different." And for the first time in the while Pamela had known him, Tony Gonzalo smiled, not the cold professional smile he used in meetings, but something genuine and terrifying in its vulnerability. "I think you'd like her." Pamela watched in disbelief as Tony, a man who trusted no one, who'd built his entire life on paranoia and careful distance, transformed into something she never imagined. Hopeful. 3 months later, Tony called a mandatory staff meeting. Everyone gathered in the main living room, confused and slightly anxious, because Tony didn't do staff meetings unless someone was getting terminated. He stood at the front, looking simultaneously elated and uncomfortable, like a man unused to sharing good news. "I wanted you all to hear this from me first. I've asked Zelda to marry me." She said yes. The staff erupted in polite applause. Pamela felt her stomach drop but forced a smile. Tony pulled up a video on the large screen, an introduction clip Zelda had apparently sent to meet the team. The woman who appeared was breathtaking. Glossy dark hair, porcelain skin, eyes that sparkled with manufactured warmth. She spoke about how excited she was to join the Gonzalo family, how much she'd heard about the wonderful staff, how she couldn't wait to make this house a home. Pamela watched, noting how every word sounded rehearsed, how Zelda's smile never quite reached those sparkling eyes, how the whole presentation felt more like a corporate acquisition than a love story. But Tony was beaming, and the other staff members were charmed. And maybe Pamela was just being paranoid because she didn't want to lose the only father figure she'd ever had. Then she heard it. A low, rumbling growl that raised every hair on her arms. Bruno stood at Tony's side, teeth bared, hackles raised, every muscle in his body rigid with warning. The German shepherd who loved everyone, who greeted strangers with tail wags and gentle nuzzles, was staring at Zelda's image on the screen like she was a threat that needed eliminating. The growl built to a snarl. Bruno's lips pulled back, revealing teeth designed for protection. Several staff members stepped back nervously, and Pamela felt ice flood her veins because she'd worked with this dog for 10 years, and she'd never not once seen him react to anyone with aggression. Tony laughed, the sound forced and uncomfortable. "Bruno, easy boy. He'll get used to her. He's just not used to me bringing anyone around." But Bruno didn't stop growling. And Pamela, watching the dog's absolute certainty that this woman represented danger, knew with devastating clarity that everything was about to fall apart. Dogs don't lie. They can't fake instinct. And Bruno's instinct was screaming what Pamela's gut had been whispering since Tony said Zelda's name. Something was very, very wrong. Has your pet ever made you sense an omen? I would love to hear your story. Kindly tell me where you are listening from. Please subscribe as the story unravels. Thank you. The wedding happened so fast it felt like Tony had been swept into a riptide 6 months from first date to "I do," and Pamela watched from the staff section feeling like she was witnessing a beautifully orchestrated car crash in slow motion. Zelda's family was conspicuously absent, explained away with a story about estrangement that sounded rehearsed enough to be a TED Talk. The guest list was minimal, mostly Tony's business associates, who looked vaguely confused about being at a wedding instead of a negotiation. And Tony himself stood at the altar looking simultaneously ecstatic and terrified, like a man who'd won the lottery but couldn't shake the feeling he'd misread the numbers. Zelda was a vision in white, all flowing silk and strategic tears, saying exactly the right things at exactly the right moments. She touched Tony's face with perfect tenderness during the vows, and even Pamela had to admit the woman was good, too good, like she'd studied romance the way other people studied for the bar exam methodically, thoroughly, with zero room for authentic emotion. Pamela stood in her formal uniform, hands clasped, and felt her savings account screaming at her from whatever metaphysical space savings accounts occupy. Get out. This is not your problem. You've got $47,000. Start your bakery. Leave before this disaster becomes yours. It was the smart play, the survival play. Everything her 22-year-old self had learned about protecting herself said to walk away from situations that smelled wrong. But she didn't leave, because 2 nights before the wedding, Tony had found her in the kitchen doing inventory, and he'd said quietly, almost apologetically, "Thank you for staying. I know she's a lot, but I finally have a chance at a real family." And Pamela couldn't tell him what she suspected, that Zelda wasn't building a family. She was planning a funeral. Life under Zelda's regime changed immediately, like someone had rewritten the house rules overnight without bothering to post the updated version. She was cruel to the staff in ways that never left marks, the kind of cruelty that came with plausible deniability and a beautiful smile. Cutting comments about incompetence delivered loud enough for everyone to hear. Impossible demands that set people up for failure. Humiliations packaged as helpful suggestions that made grown adults want to cry in supply closets. She treated Pamela with particular disdain, like a queen dealing with a rival who didn't know she'd already lost. One morning, Zelda appeared in the kitchen while Pamela was preparing breakfast, examining her manicured nails with the focus most people reserved for art. "You've been here quite a while, haven't you, Pamela? 10 years? The question was casual, but the subtext was a knife. Tony must have been very lonely to depend on the help so much. Well, she smiled, and it was the coldest thing Pamela had ever seen. He has a real family now. The implication was clear. Your time is up, and you're replaceable. Pamela bit her tongue hard enough to taste copper and kept arranging pastries like her hands weren't shaking with rage. Bruno's distrust escalated to outright aggression within weeks. The dog, who'd never met a human he didn't like, refused to be in the same room as Zelda, growling whenever she approached, positioning himself between her and Tony like a furry, four-legged security system. Tony, desperate to keep peace, and probably terrified his new wife would demand he choose, started locking Bruno outside during meals. Pamela watched through the kitchen window as the German Shepherd paced the yard, whining, and thought, "At least one of us is allowed to show how we really feel." But worse than the staff mistreatment, worse than Bruno's banishment, was watching Tony change. The man who'd worked 18-hour days with machine-like efficiency now seemed constantly exhausted, more withdrawn, more obedient to his new wife's suggestions. He stopped having their morning coffee conversations. Zelda served him tea in bed now, apparently, some special blend she prepared herself. He stopped asking Pamela's opinion on household decisions. He stopped, in ways that hurt more than Pamela wanted to admit, being the person she'd spent a decade learning to call family. 6 months into the marriage, Tony's health started declining in ways that couldn't be ignored. He was constantly fatigued, suffering headaches that left him pale and sweating, occasional nausea that sent him to the bathroom during important meetings. Zelda was all concern, the perfect worried wife, insisting he see doctors, who found nothing, suggesting rest, personally preparing his morning tea, with special herbs to boost his energy. She'd deliver it with such tenderness, brushing his hair back, kissing his forehead, playing the role so convincingly that even Pamela sometimes wondered if she was just being paranoid. The other staff members gossiped in whispers. Maybe marriage at 45 didn't agree with him. Maybe the stress of a wife after decades of solitude was catching up. Maybe he just needed to adjust. But Pamela, who'd watched her uncle's wife slowly destroy him, with substances purchased from people who didn't ask questions, recognized something else. The gradual, systematic breakdown of a body being deliberately harmed. She started watching with the intensity of someone conducting surveillance, and what she saw made her physically sick. Zelda prepared Tony's morning tea in the private kitchen, a small room off the master suite that staff weren't allowed to enter under pain of termination. She'd emerge every morning at exactly 7 a.m. with a delicate china cup, steam rising, smiling like a woman who genuinely cared. She served it personally, never letting anyone else handle the cup, staying with Tony while he drank every drop. And within an hour, like clockwork, he'd be exhausted, unfocused, his hands trembling when he tried to sign documents. Pamela started tracking the pattern obsessively. Every morning, tea from Zelda, followed by hours of Tony being too weak to work effectively. On the rare mornings when Zelda was out early and Tony skipped the tea, he was noticeably sharper, more energetic, more like himself. It wasn't coincidence. It was cause and effect. She needed proof, something concrete that couldn't be dismissed as paranoia or jealousy, or a disgruntled employee bitter about losing influence. One evening, after Zelda and Tony had gone to bed, Pamela used the master key she technically wasn't supposed to have, but which Tony had given her years ago for emergencies, and slipped into the private kitchen. Her hands shook as she searched cabinets, heart hammering so loud she was sure someone would hear. And then she found it. A container labeled Herbal Energy Supplement, Natural Vitality Blend, tucked behind ordinary tea boxes. Pamela recognized the label immediately, the same deliberately vague branding her uncle's wife had kept in their medicine cabinet, purchased from contacts who operated in the spaces between legal and catastrophically illegal. She opened the container carefully, saw the white powder inside, and her stomach dropped. Arsenic, small doses, building up over time, designed to look like natural organ failure, heart attack, kidney disease, stroke, any number of things that happen to middle-aged men under stress. Pamela stood in that private kitchen, container in hand, and felt the full weight of what she'd discovered. This wasn't a bad marriage. This wasn't even gold-digging or manipulation. This was premeditated elimination, executed with patience and precision by someone who'd planned every detail. She had her escape route. The money was saved. The bakery plan was ready. She could quit tomorrow, take her $47,000, disappear to another state and start fresh. Let Tony deal with his own terrible marriage choices. Let him figure out why his health was failing. Let him... Pamela sat on the floor of that private kitchen, container of substances in her lap, and thought about a man who'd interviewed a desperate 22-year-old girl with 3 garbage bags and no prospects, and hired her anyway, who'd shared stale birthday cake at 2 a.m. because they were both too lonely to pretend otherwise, who remembered her favorite coffee order after one conversation, who asked about her day even when his own empire was crumbling, who'd become the father she never had without either of them having to say the words that made it real and therefore terrifying. She made her decision, and the next morning, while Zelda was out getting her nails done or whatever villain activities she had scheduled, Pamela knocked on Tony's office door with the kind of determination that comes from knowing you're about to blow up your entire life but doing it anyway. "Sir, I need to speak with you. It's urgent." Tony looked up from paperwork, and Pamela's heart broke a little at how exhausted he looked, shadows under his eyes, skin pale, hands trembling slightly as he set down his pen. "Can it wait? I have a meeting in. Your wife is poisoning you." 6 words. That's all it took for the world to stop spinning. Tony stared at her like she'd just announced the sky was actually green and gravity was a conspiracy theory. "What? Pamela? That's insane. Zelda loves me. She's been taken care of." Pamela crossed the room and dropped the herbal supplement container on his desk, with a thud that sounded like a gavel. "Read the label, carefully." Tony picked up the container, confusion shifting to concentration as he examined it. Pamela watched the recognition dawn in his eyes the way they widened, then narrowed, reading the label over and over like hoping the words would change. He turned it over, saw the telltale signs of tampering, the underground market indicators anyone in his line of work would recognize instantly. His face went white. Actually white, like every drop of blood had decided to evacuate. "How long?" The whisper was barely audible. 6 months, sir. Since the wedding." Tony sat back in his leather chair, the one that had cost more than most people's cars, and for the first time since Pamela had known him, she saw tears gathering in his eyes. Actual tears. From a man who'd built a reputation on being harder than stone. Why would she? But Pamela saw it before he finished the question. The laptop on his desk, open to financial transfers Zelda had been helping him organize. Routing money through shell companies Pamela didn't recognize. Spreadsheets with names that meant nothing to her but clearly meant something to someone. And in the reflection of the window behind Tony's head, a tiny red light that made her blood freeze, a security camera positioned perfectly to capture his computer screen, installed sometime in the last month when they'd been updating the security system at Zelda's suggestion. This wasn't just attempted demise, this was corporate espionage, intelligence gathering, a long-game operation to steal everything. Tony had built his money, his contacts, his entire empire, before erasing him from the equation entirely. And Tony Gonzalo, legendary operator who'd survived 4 decades in a world where trust was currency and betrayal was commonplace, had been played like a complete fool by the first woman he'd ever loved. Tony sat across from Pamela in his locked office, Bruno finally allowed inside after weeks of exile, pressed against his owner's leg like he could sense the danger radiating through the room. The German Shepherd's presence was somehow comforting. At least one living thing in this house still had functioning instincts. Tony's voice was quiet, controlled, the kind of quiet that came before explosions. "Tell me everything." Pamela laid it out methodically, like she was presenting evidence in court. The tea ritual that never varied, the symptoms that followed with predictable precision, the arsenic disguised as wellness supplements, the security camera installations that Zelda had sold as upgrades for Tony's protection, the financial transfers to companies that existed only on paper. She watched Tony's expression shift from disbelief to rage, to something colder and far more dangerous: calculation. The strategic mind that had built an empire was clicking into place, and Pamela felt relief and terror in equal measure. "She came after me on purpose," Tony said, finally, his voice flat. "This wasn't chance. This wasn't even opportunistic. Someone sent her." He pulled up files on his computer, fingers moving with renewed energy despite the trembling, and started running searches on Zelda's background. Information he now realized he should have investigated before proposing background checks that had come back suspiciously clean. No real history before 5 years ago. References that were probably manufactured. A past so carefully scrubbed it practically glowed with artificiality. Within an hour, they'd connected enough dots to draw a devastating picture. Shell companies linked to Don Enzo's syndicate, digital footprints carefully scrubbed but not well enough to fool someone who knew what to look for. Financial transactions that formed a pattern any investigator would recognize. A deep-cover operation 5 years in the making. Zelda hadn't stumbled into Tony's life, she'd been aimed at him like a weapon. "We could confront her," Pamela suggested, though even as she said it, she knew it was the wrong play. Tony shook his head, drumming his fingers on the desk in a rhythm that meant he was thinking 3 moves ahead. "She's not working alone. If we spook her now, she disappears. Enzo walks free, and I look like a paranoid fool who's losing his grip. Worse," his jaw tightened. "She accelerates the timeline and actually finishes what she started." Pamela felt ice flooding her stomach. "What are you thinking?" Tony met her eyes, and she saw something she recognized from the man who'd built an empire through calculated risk. Absolute determination. I'm thinking that if I'm going to go down anyway, we might as well make it count. We need to catch her in the act, and we need to take down Enzo at the same time. The plan Tony outlined was insane, the kind of insane that made Pamela wonder if the substances in his system had affected his judgment. They'd switch the tea without Zelda's knowledge, replacing the tainted version with harmless herbal blends, making Tony appear to continue deteriorating while actually flushing the harmful materials from his system. Pamela, who had the master key to the private kitchen, would make the swap every morning before Zelda's 7 a.m. routine. Tony would fake increasing illness, more stumbling, more confusion, more visible decline, giving Zelda confidence that her plan was working perfectly while he secretly documented everything. Financial crimes, communications with Enzo, evidence of the systematic harm, all of it recorded and backed up in locations Zelda would never think to check. But there was a problem that made the whole operation potentially impossible. They couldn't just go to the police. Tony's empire had layers of illegal activity, decades of operations that existed in gray areas and sometimes pitch-black ones. Any investigation would expose him too, and while Zelda might go to prison, Tony would be right there with her. They'd take each other down in a mutual destruction that served no one except Don Enzo, who'd probably send flowers to both their cells. What if, Pamela said slowly, the idea forming even as she spoke, you turned yourself in first, on your terms, with leverage? Tony stared at her like she'd suggested he sprout wings and fly to the moon. It was the riskiest play possible. Voluntarily surrender to law enforcement, offer cooperation in exchange for a plea deal, and use that authority collaboration to create an airtight case against Zelda and Don Enzo. But it meant admitting to crimes he'd spent decades concealing. It meant prison time, even with a deal. It meant trusting a system that had never been on his side, that had failed him as a foster kid, and taught him early that the only person he could rely on was himself. You'd really do this? Pamela asked quietly. Risk everything, your freedom, your empire, everything you've built just to make sure they go down? Tony looked at Bruno, who gazed back with the uncomplicated devotion only dogs can manage, then at Pamela, whose loyalty had proven stronger than blood or obligation. I spent 45 years thinking I didn't deserve a family because of what I do, because of the choices I made, the lines I crossed, the things I can't undo. Then I found one anyway, found you, found this. He gestured between them. Whatever this is that we don't have words for. Zelda tried to take that from me, tried to take you from me. So yeah, I'd risk everything. He paused, and his voice softened. Question is, are you sure you want to be part of this? You could still walk away, take your savings, start your bakery, be free of all of this mess. You don't owe me anything, Pamela. You've already saved my life. You don't have to sacrifice yours, too. Pamela thought about the girl who'd shown up at these gates years ago with 3 garbage bags and no hope, running from a family that treated her like a burden they couldn't wait to discard. Then she thought about the man who'd given her dignity, safety, and something she'd never had before. A father's love that didn't come with conditions or expiration dates. I'm not leaving, she said firmly, surprised by how steady her voice was. We started this family together. We're ending this threat together. Tony nodded. And for the first time in months, maybe since Zelda had entered their lives, he smiled. A real smile, not the hollow performance he'd been giving lately. Then let's burn it all down. The operation began with the kind of precision Tony usually reserved for major business moves. Every morning at 6:30 a.m., Pamela would slip into the private kitchen and replace Zelda's prepared tea with identical-looking but harmless herbal blends. Tony's decline became theatrical. He stumbled more convincingly than any actor, complained of confusion that was 90% performance and 10% genuine exhaustion from the stress, had Zelda call doctors multiple times for visits that were secretly documented by federal contacts already being brought into the plan. He let Zelda take over more business operations, giving her access she thought she was stealing, while he secretly copied every transaction she made, every contact she reached out to, every piece of evidence they'd need to build an airtight case. He reached out to a federal contact, Agent Rebecca Morris, someone he had complicated history with, but who'd always played surprisingly fair in a game usually rigged from the start, and made the offer. Full cooperation on organized crime activities in exchange for immunity on specified charges and a reduced sentence on others. It took weeks of negotiation that left Tony looking genuinely exhausted, which helped sell the poisoning narrative to Zelda. The feds wanted everything: names, dates, locations, the full architecture of his operations. Tony gave them enough to be useful, but not enough to completely dismantle the network he'd spent decades building. Some bridges you burn, some you just damage enough to be convincing. The deal was finally struck. He'd help them take down Don Enzo's entire syndicate and deliver Zelda with evidence that would guarantee life sentences. And in exchange, Tony would serve 5 years instead of life. 5 years of his life traded for justice, and the satisfaction of knowing Zelda and Enzo would rot in cells until they were too old to remember why they'd started this game. But there was one final piece, one move that would either win everything or lose it all. Tony explained it one evening in his office. Pamela and Bruno both present like some bizarre family meeting. We need to catch Zelda in an undeniable act. Something so clear, so documented, that no lawyer can spin it. And I have an idea. He paused, and Pamela knew immediately she was going to hate it. We're going to fake my death. Absolutely not, Pamela said before he could elaborate. But Tony continued like she hadn't spoken. For real. Medical-grade sedative that mimics death for up to 6 hours, no pulse, no breath, body temperature drop, the whole package. Zelda will think she's won. She'll drop her guard. She'll make her victory calls to Enzo. Start the financial transfers. Maybe even celebrate. And that's when we bring in the authorities. They catch her in the act of trying to cover up what she thinks is my demise. We have recordings of everything. And the case is airtight. Pamela grabbed his arm hard enough to leave marks. That's insane. What if something goes wrong? What if the sedative actually ends you? What if your body can't handle it, or the dose is wrong, or... Tony covered her hand with his, and the gesture was so gentle it made her throat tight. Then you'll have evidence of everything. The feds are already in position. Zelda and Enzo go down either way, but I don't think it'll come to that. I trust the doctor Agent Morris is bringing in former military, done this procedure dozens of times for undercover operations. And more importantly, his voice dropped, I trust you. If something goes wrong, I know you'll make sure this meant something. The morning of the operation arrived with the kind of finality that made Pamela want to vomit. Tony took the sedative at 6 a.m., a dose carefully calculated to put him into a death-like state by 8 a.m., lasting until approximately 2 p.m. Pamela watched the clock, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, in her fingertips, in every nerve that screamed this was a terrible idea. At 7:45 a.m., Tony told Zelda he wasn't feeling well, that he was going back to bed, not to disturb him, and Pamela, watching from the hallway through a carefully positioned mirror, saw something that turned her stomach to acid. Zelda's eyes lit up, not with concern or worry or even fake sympathy, with eager anticipation, like a kid on Christmas morning who knew exactly what present was waiting. Of course, darling, Zelda cooed, touching his face with manufactured tenderness. Rest. I'll check on you later. Later meant after he's dead. Pamela realized with sickening clarity. Zelda was going to wait until evening to discover the body, giving herself all day to complete financial transfers, make calls, set up her narrative, the perfect grieving widow who'd tragically lost her husband to sudden illness. At 8:03 a.m., Zelda left for errands, probably meeting with Enzo's financial people, Pamela thought bitterly. The moment the car pulled away, Pamela knocked gently on Tony's bedroom door. No answer. She knocked again, louder. Still nothing. With hands that shook so badly she almost couldn't turn the knob, she entered. Tony was on the bed, absolutely still, positioned exactly as he'd planned. His skin was pale, not just pale, but corpse pale, that waxy quality that made her breath catch. She moved closer, reached out to check for a pulse at his neck. Nothing. She pressed harder, searching for any flutter of life. Still nothing. She held her hand near his mouth, feeling for breath, not even a whisper of air. It's working, she told herself. He looks completely, utterly dead. Which was the point. Which was exactly what they needed. And Pamela, who'd known this was the plan, who'd helped coordinate every detail, still felt panic clawing up her throat like a living thing trying to escape. For the next 6 hours, she had to act normal. Had to manage staff, handle household operations, maintain the facade that everything was fine, while the man she considered family lay upstairs in a chemically induced death state. One mistake, one curious staff member checking on the boss, one emergency that required his attention, one moment where someone discovered him too early and everything fell apart. She closed the door gently and walked downstairs on legs that felt like they might give out any second. 6 hours. She just had to survive 6 hours of pretending the world wasn't ending. The clock on the wall read 8:07 a.m., and Pamela realized with horrifying clarity that this was going to be the longest day of her entire life. The day passed in agonizing slow motion, each minute stretching like taffy, until Pamela thought time itself might break from the tension. She moved through the house on autopilot, directing staff, answering questions, maintaining the facade of normalcy, while internally screaming that the man she considered family was lying upstairs in a chemically induced death state, and everything could go catastrophically wrong at any second. Zelda returned at 11 a.m., and Pamela heard her before she saw her, humming some cheerful tune like she was starring in a musical about successful villainy. She breezed through the foyer in designer athleisure that probably cost more than Pamela's car, looking suspiciously refreshed for someone whose husband was supposedly ill upstairs. "Oh, Pamela," she called out, not bothering to hide the triumph in her voice. "Mr. Gonzalo is resting. Please make sure no one disturbs him today. He needs his peace." Peace. The word made Pamela want to laugh hysterically. She settled for a tight nod. "Of course, ma'am." For the next several hours, Zelda handled business calls and her office calls Pamela knew, thanks to the wiretaps Tony had authorized through his federal contacts, were with Don Enzo's financial people. She could hear Zelda's voice through the door, bright and animated, discussing transfers and timelines and arrangements with the kind of enthusiasm most people reserved for vacation planning, preparing to transfer everything once Tony was officially deceased. The audacity was almost impressive. At 2 p.m., the approximate time Tony should be waking from the sedative, Pamela's heart started hammering so hard she thought the other staff members might hear it. She manufactured an excuse about needing to deliver fresh linens upstairs, grabbed a stack of towels she didn't need, and climbed the stairs on legs that felt disconnected from her body. She entered Tony's room, heart in her throat, and closed the door behind her with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. Tony was still motionless on the bed, positioned exactly as he'd been at 8 a.m. His skin was that same waxy pale, his chest utterly still. She checked her watch with shaking hands. 2:07 p.m. The sedative should be wearing off by now. The doctor had said between 2 and 2:30 p.m. Tony would start showing signs of revival. Pamela moved closer, set down the towels she'd been clutching like a lifeline, and put her hand near his mouth, feeling for breath. Nothing. Not even the faintest whisper of air. She checked his pulse. Nothing. 2:10 p.m. Still nothing. Panic started clawing its way past her professional calm, tearing through the careful composure she'd maintained all day. What if the dose was wrong? What if his body, already weakened by 6 months of actual poisoning, couldn't handle the sedative? What if they'd accidentally done exactly what Zelda had been trying to accomplish? She pressed harder on his neck, searching desperately for any sign of life, her own pulse roaring in her ears so loud she almost missed it. Then so faint she thought she might be imagining it out of pure desperation, a tiny, shallow breath. His chest rose microscopically, barely enough to see but definitely there. He's coming back. Pamela nearly collapsed with relief, gripping the edge of the bed to steady herself. She leaned close to his ear, voice barely a whisper. "I'm here. It's working. Hold on." She didn't know if he could hear her in whatever dark place the sedative had taken him, but she needed to say it anyway. Needed him to know that if he was fighting his way back to consciousness, he wasn't doing it alone. She straightened, smoothed her uniform with trembling hands, picked up her unnecessary stack of towels, and left the room. Closed the door gently, walked downstairs to continue the most important performance of her life, acting like everything was normal, while the man she considered family lay upstairs, technically dead, and the woman who'd tried to eliminate him prepared for her victory lap. The afternoon dragged on with the surreal quality of a fever dream. Pamela managed household tasks, responded to staff questions, and avoided Zelda, who seemed to be in increasingly high spirits as the day progressed. At 4 p.m., Zelda ordered an elaborate dinner, celebratory, Pamela realized with disgust, and spent an hour on the phone laughing with someone who was definitely Enzo. Pamela caught snippets through the office door. Almost over. Yes, everything's in place. Tomorrow will be unstoppable. At 6 p.m., Zelda made her move. She emerged from her office looking appropriately concerned, the mask back in place, and announced to the assembled staff that Mr. Gonzalo still wasn't feeling well, and had specifically asked not to be disturbed. "He's resting," she said with practiced worry, "but I'm getting concerned. He hasn't responded to my messages." The setup was so obvious Pamela wanted to scream, but the other staff members just nodded sympathetically, offering concerned murmurs about calling doctors in the morning if he wasn't better. Zelda ordered dinner, ate it with theatrical disinterest, while occasionally staring at the ceiling like a worried wife. And at 7:30 p.m., right on schedule, Pamela thought bitterly. She stood abruptly, her face a mask of sudden fear. "I need everyone to come upstairs with me," she said, voice shaking perfectly. "Something's wrong. I've been messaging Tony all day, and he's not responding. I can't get him to answer the door." The staff exchanged genuinely concerned looks. Pamela's heart hammered against her ribs. This is it. This is the moment, as they all followed Zelda up the grand staircase. The personal nurse, Mrs. Chen, who'd been on staff for years and actually cared about Tony, was called from her quarters. "Please," Zelda said, gripping the older woman's arm with manufactured desperation. "I think something's really wrong." Zelda opened the bedroom door with trembling hands. God, she's good at this, Pamela thought with visceral disgust and stepped inside. The staff crowded behind her, Pamela positioning herself at the back where she could see everything. Tony was on the bed exactly as he'd been for hours. Pale, cold, utterly still. In the evening light filtering through the curtains, he looked like a Renaissance painting of death, beautiful and terrible and completely convincing. Mrs. Chen rushed forward with the urgency of someone who'd seen genuine medical emergencies, checking for vital signs with professional efficiency. Her hands moved from his neck to his wrist to his chest, and Pamela watched the older woman's face go white as paper. She checked again, pressing harder, searching for any sign of life that wasn't there. Finally, she straightened, turning to face Zelda with an expression of devastating sympathy. "Mrs. Gonzalo, I'm so sorry. There's no pulse, no respiration. He's gone." The words landed like bombs in the hushed room. Staff members gasped, hands flying to mouths. Someone started crying genuine tears for a boss most of them had respected, even if they'd found him distant. And Zelda crumpled artistically against the doorframe, a perfect picture of devastated widow, her body shaking with sobs that would have won awards if grief were a competitive sport. "No," she sobbed, the word breaking beautifully. "No, no, no. I should have checked on him earlier. I should have insisted he see a doctor this afternoon. I should have." Her voice dissolved into wrenching sobs, and she pulled out her phone with hands that shook like leaves in a hurricane. "I need to call for help. I need an ambulance. The authorities. Someone has to. This is the moment. Everything hinges on this. Every hour of planning, every risk they'd taken, every terrifying second of this impossible day, all of it came down to the next 30 seconds. Pamela stepped forward, her voice cutting through the manufactured chaos like a blade through silk. "Ma'am, you don't need to call anyone." Every head in the room swiveled toward her. The crying stopped. The air itself seemed to freeze, and Zelda's expression flickered through emotions too quickly to fully mask. Confusion, then irritation, then something much darker that made Pamela's spine straighten with vindication. "Excuse me?" Zelda's voice had edges now, the grief-stricken widow facade cracking around the syllables. "The nurse just confirmed my husband is dead, Pamela. We need emergency services immediately." Pamela's voice was steady, cold, absolutely certain. "He's not dead." The room went silent. You could have heard a pin drop on carpet. Zelda's face cycled through emotions too rapidly to control. Shock morphing into rage, morphing into calculation, morphing into fear, and Pamela watched it all with the satisfaction of someone who'd spent months being treated like disposable help finally getting to deliver the truth. "What are you talking about?" Zelda hissed, taking a step forward. "How dare you?" the nurse confirmed. "Everyone can see." And then they heard it. From outside, growing louder with every second. Sirens, multiple sirens. Car doors slamming with the weight of authority. The unmistakable sound of official vehicles pulling up to the estate. Gravel crunching under heavy tires. Radios crackling with professional efficiency. Zelda's face drained of color so quickly Pamela thought the woman might actually faint. "What did you do?" she hissed, whirling on Pamela with pure venom. "What the hell did you do?" The bedroom door burst open. Wider Pamela had deliberately left it unlocked, and federal agents poured in like a tactical flood, badges drawn, voices commanding attention with the kind of authority that made even innocent people nervous. Zelda Inovov, the lead agent Rebecca Morris, Pamela recognized from Tony's descriptions, announced with professional precision. "You're under arrest for attempted elimination, fraud, conspiracy, and espionage on behalf of a criminal organization." Zelda staggered backward, her eyes wild. darting between the agents and Pamela and the door like a trapped animal, searching for escape routes that didn't exist. No, this is insane. My husband is dead. I just found him. She gestured frantically at Tony's body, her voice climbing to hysteria. He's right there. Everyone saw, the nurse confirmed. And on the bed, like something from a horror movie or a miracle depending on your perspective, Tony Gonzalo's eyes opened, not slowly, not gradually, but all at once, brown eyes that had been vacant suddenly focusing on the ceiling, then moving to take in the room full of people staring at him like he'd just performed the resurrection. He drew a deep, shuddering breath, the kind of breath that sounded like it came from the bottom of a well, and sat up slowly. Movements deliberate and controlled, like someone rising from a grave who wanted everyone to appreciate the dramatic effect. Every staff member screamed. Mrs. Chen actually stumbled backward, crossing herself and muttering prayers in Mandarin. Someone dropped their phone with a clatter that sounded like thunder, but Pamela just stood there, arms crossed, watching Zelda's world implode with the kind of satisfaction that probably wasn't healthy but felt absolutely earned. Tony's voice was rough from hours of death state, scraped raw from whatever biological hell the sedative had put him through, but his words were clear enough to cut glass. "Hello, darling. Sorry about the dramatics, but we needed you to think you'd won." Zelda lunged not at Tony, which might have been expected, but at Pamela, screaming with the kind of rage that came from someone who'd spent years planning something only to watch it disintegrate in seconds. "You bitch. You ruined everything!" But federal agents grabbed her before she made contact, hands professional and firm on her arms, pulling her back while she thrashed like something feral. Tony slowly got out of bed, steadier than he should have been for someone who'd been technically dead for 6 hours, and faced his wife, the woman he'd loved, the woman who'd tried to eliminate him. 5 years, he said quietly, and the room went silent again, because everyone wanted to hear this. "You spent 5 years planning this, studying me, learning my patterns, making me fall in love with you, planning my demise, all for Enzo." Zelda's face contorted between rage and desperate calculation, like she was trying to find an angle, a story, something that could salvage this situation. "You don't understand," she said, and her voice had shifted to something pleading, manipulative, the tone of someone who'd spent a lifetime talking her way out of consequences. "Don Enzo and I, we could have built something incredible. Your empire, his resources, his connections, your operational genius. We could have owned everything, controlled everything." "Yeah," Tony interrupted, and there was something in his voice that made even the federal agents pause. Not anger, exactly, something sadder and harder. "But you forgot one thing. I already had everything. I had loyalty. I had family. I had people who chose me not for what I could give them, not for what they could take, but because they actually gave a damn. You never understood that. You never could." As agents moved to lead Zelda away, reading her rights in that professional monotone that made everything sound like a grocery list, she screamed over her shoulder, dignity completely abandoned. "This isn't over. Don Enzo will come for you. Don Enzo was arrested 2 hours ago," Agent Morris interjected calmly, consulting her phone like she was checking the weather. "During a meeting where he was celebrating your success, actually, surrounded by his financial advisors and enough incriminating evidence to fill a warehouse. He's going away for 40 years minimum, probably longer once we finish processing everything." Zelda's scream echoed down the hallway as agents dragged her away, the sound fading like a siren until doors closed and cut it off completely. The staff stood frozen, trying to process what they'd just witnessed, their boss rising from the dead, his wife arrested, a sting operation that belonged in movies rather than real life. But Pamela barely heard any of it, because Tony was looking at her with an expression she'd never seen before. Gratitude so profound it didn't need words. Respect so deep it made her throat tight, and something else that looked suspiciously like the way a father might look at a daughter who just saved his life. "You saved my life," he said quietly, and his voice was raw with emotion he'd spent decades learning to suppress. Pamela shook her head, tears finally breaking through the professional composure she'd maintained all day, hot and honest and completely earned. "No, sir. You saved mine first. Years ago, when I showed up here with garbage bags and no hope. I just returned the favor." Tony, however, still had his crimes to face to really save himself completely, something he hoped will come with redemption. 6 months later, Pamela stood outside the federal correctional facility, leaning against her car, a modest sedan she'd bought with her savings. sensible and reliable in the way she'd learned to be after years of uncertainty. The bakery she'd opened 3 months ago was doing well, better than she'd dared to hope. Turns out a decade of managing household staff, dealing with impossible personalities, and coordinating complex schedules translated beautifully into running a small business. Who knew? She visited every Sunday, the one day of the week she allowed herself to close shop early. It had become a ritual, sacred in the way routines become when they're chosen rather than obligatory. The visit room was nothing like the Gonzalo estate. Cinder block walls painted institutional beige, hard plastic chairs bolted to the floor, guards watching with the bored efficiency of people who'd seen every human drama play out and were no longer impressed by any of it. But when Tony walked in, wearing prison-issue clothes that hung slightly wrong on his frame, his smile was genuine. More genuine, actually, than most of the smiles he'd worn during his years running an empire. "How's business?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her with the careful movements of someone who'd learned prison had its own rules about personal space and sudden gestures. Pamela launched into stories about difficult customers like Mrs. Henderson, who insisted her gluten-free order wasn't gluten-free enough and demanded to speak to the manager, not realizing Pamela was the manager. Recipe experiments that had gone hilariously wrong, including a sourdough starter she'd accidentally turned into something that could probably be classified as a biohazard. And the teenage kid she'd hired last month, Marcus, who reminded her uncomfortably of herself at that age. Scrappy, desperate, carrying that specific kind of hunger that came from needing a chance no one seemed willing to give. Tony listened the way he always had, asking questions that proved he was actually paying attention, offering advice that was surprisingly useful for someone who'd never run a legitimate business in his life. "You're probably overpaying for flour," he noted. "I know a guy well. Knew a guy who could get wholesale pricing that would cut your costs by 20%. Then he paused, grimacing. "Although maybe don't take business advice from someone currently in prison for organized crime. That might not be the best look for your bakery." Pamela laughed, and it felt good, normal, like they were just family catching up, not a former maid visiting her former employer in a federal facility. They talked for an hour, carefully avoiding the topic that loomed between them like furniture too large to move. Tony had 4.5 years left on his sentence. The plea deal had saved him from life imprisonment, had kept him alive when Zelda's plan would have eliminated him completely, but it was still a significant chunk of time. Years Pamela would spend building a business while Tony aged in a cell, separated from the only family either of them had. "Are you doing okay in here?" Pamela asked, because she needed to know. Needed to hear him say it even if it was a lie. Tony shrugged, the gesture more honest than his words. "It's not great. The food is terrible. The company is worse, and I've had more philosophical conversations with Bruno than I've had with my cellmate. But I've been in worse places." He met her eyes, and something in his expression made her throat tight. "And I know this isn't forever. I know you'll still be there when I get out." It wasn't a question, but Pamela answered anyway, needing him to hear the certainty in her voice. "Every Sunday until they let you go. And then I'm picking you up, and we're getting the world's greasiest diner breakfast. And you're going to tell me all your terrible business ideas for my bakery that I'll politely ignore before implementing the actually good ones without admitting they came from you." Tony laughed, a real laugh, the kind that crinkled his eyes and made him look younger despite the gray threading through his hair, the kind of laugh he never did before Pamela came into his life and decided he was worth saving. "Deal." The visiting hour ended too quickly, the way good things always did. A guard announced time was up with the enthusiasm of someone reading a warranty disclaimer, and Pamela watched Tony stand, straighten his ill-fitting uniform, and head back toward the doors that would lock behind him. He turned at the threshold, gave her a small wave, and disappeared into the facility's depths. Pamela drove home past the Gonzalo estate, which had been seized by the government as part of the plea agreement. She wondered briefly what had happened to Bruno, adopted by one of the kinder former staff members. She knew, living out his days being spoiled in ways Tony would have approved of. Whether the rose garden she used to tend was being maintained, or if it had gone wild and beautiful in her absence. If the kitchen where they'd shared stale birthday cake at 2 a.m. was empty now, or if some government official used it to make coffee while cataloging Tony's seized assets. But she didn't slow down. That was never really home anyway. Home was the connection, not the building. Home was Sunday visits and terrible prison coffee, and the knowledge that someone chose you on purpose. 4 years and 2 months later, Pamela arrived at the correctional facility at 6 a.m., a full hour before official release time, clutching 2 coffees from her bakery and a box of pastries she'd made fresh that morning. The bakery now had 2 locations and a reputation solid enough that food bloggers occasionally showed up to take pictures of her croissants. She'd hired 8 employees, mentored 3 kids who reminded her of her younger self, and learned that success felt better when you built it honestly. Tony walked out at exactly 7:03 a.m., and Pamela felt her breath catch despite knowing this moment was coming. He looked older, more gray, deeper lines around his eyes, the kind of aging that happened when time moved slowly and you had nothing to do but think about your choices. But somehow he also looked more at peace than he ever had as a crime boss, like prison had stripped away something heavy he'd been carrying without realizing it. He spotted Pamela immediately, and his face transformed. Not the careful neutrality he'd worn for years, not the professional mask, but pure, unfiltered joy that made her eyes burn with tears she refused to shed in a prison parking lot. She held out a coffee. "Told you I'd pick you up." "I never doubted it," Tony replied, taking the cup and inhaling like it was oxygen. "God, I missed real coffee. Whatever they serve in there is a crime against humanity." "You're allowed to complain about crimes now that you've served your time," Pamela said, grinning. "It's very meta." They drove to a diner that was exactly as greasy as promised, the kind of place with laminated menus and waitresses who called everyone "hon" and coffee that came in endless refills. Over eggs that were somehow both burnt and undercooked and toast that had seen better days. Tony asked about the bakery, about Pamela's life, about everything he'd missed during 4 years of Sunday visits that could only capture so much. She told him about the new apartment she was renting in a neighborhood that actually had trees and a coffee shop that wasn't also a crime scene. The community college business courses she'd been taking, learning theories she'd already figured out through trial and error but appreciating the vocabulary to describe them. The fact that she was thinking about writing a cookbook, nothing fancy, just recipes that got her through hard times, the kind of food that felt like a hug when the world was cold. "What about you?" she asked, watching him push eggs around his plate. "What's next?" Tony was quiet for a moment, staring at his coffee like it held answers. "Honestly, I don't know. I'm 55 years old. Most of my former connections won't touch me now that I cooperated with the feds. I'm effectively blacklisted from the only world I knew how to navigate. I've got a little money put aside that wasn't seized, but not enough to rebuild an empire." He paused, and something like relief crossed his face. "Not that I want to anymore. I think maybe I'm done with that life. Problem is, I don't know what else I'm qualified for. My resume is basically successful criminal who eventually got caught. That doesn't translate well to legitimate employment." Pamela considered this, watching him wrestle with uncertainty in a way the old Tony never would have allowed anyone to see. Then she said carefully, casually, like the idea had just occurred to her, rather than being something she'd been planning for months. "You know, I could use a business partner. Someone who understands operations, knows how to manage difficult situations, isn't afraid of hard work. The pay wouldn't be anything like what you're used to," she grinned. "And by that I mean it would be basically nothing compared to running a criminal empire. But it's honest work, legal work, the kind that lets you sleep at night." Tony stared at her like she'd just offered him the moon. "You'd really do that? After everything? After I dragged you into the most dangerous situation of your life, because I was stupid enough to fall for a woman who was literally trying to eliminate me. You gave me a chance when I was 22 and had nothing but garbage bags and desperation." Pamela said simply, "You became my family when I didn't think I deserved one." "Yeah, I'd really do that. Besides," her grin widened, "I've spent 10 years learning from the best business mind I know. Seems a shame to waste that education. Plus, someone needs to make sure you don't accidentally launder money through the bakery out of habit." Tony's laugh was half sob, and he covered his face with his hands for a moment before looking up with eyes that were suspiciously bright. "I don't deserve you." "Good thing family isn't about deserving," Pamela replied. "It's about showing up." 6 months later, the bakery's new location opened in a neighborhood that needed good food and decent jobs, the kind of area where people worked 3 jobs and still struggled, where a $5 cupcake felt like a luxury. The sign above the door read, "Pamela and Tony's Family Recipes and Second Chances," in cheerful letters that made people smile even when their days were hard. Tony handled operations and suppliers with the efficiency that had made him legendary in other contexts, negotiating prices with vendors in ways that were completely legal but still somehow intimidating. Pamela developed recipes and managed the front of house, remembering names and orders and making customers feel seen in ways that kept them coming back. They bickered about inventory. Tony insisted they were overstocked on vanilla. Pamela insisted he didn't understand seasonal demand. They laughed about difficult customers' misses. Henderson had found their new location and continued her reign of gluten-free terror. They closed up shop together every night, counting registers and cleaning equipment and falling into the kind of comfortable routine that family builds when they work side by side. It was nothing like the criminal empire Tony once ran. The stakes were lower, the profits were smaller, the danger was limited to occasional burns from the oven. But it was something better. It was honest. It was legal. And it was built on the only thing that ever really mattered: loyalty and love between two people who chose each other as family when the whole world said they shouldn't. On the anniversary of Pamela's first day at the Gonzalo estate 13 years later, somehow both an eternity and an instant, Tony found her in the bakery kitchen after closing, frosting a batch of cupcakes for tomorrow's opening. The radio played something old and comfortable, and flour dusted every surface in ways that would horrify health inspectors but felt like home. "Thank you," Tony said quietly, and something in his voice made Pamela set down the frosting bag. "For what?" "For not calling the ambulance that night. For trusting me when I asked you to be part of the most insane plan either of us had ever heard. For saving my life and then still showing up every Sunday for 4 years while I was locked up. For giving me a second chance at being a decent human being instead of just a successful criminal. For," his voice broke slightly, "for being my daughter in every way that matters, even though neither of us ever said those words until right now." Pamela felt tears building but refused to let them fall, not when she was covered in flour and buttercream and probably looked ridiculous. She wiped her hands on her apron and pulled Tony into a hug that smelled like vanilla and coffee and all the good things they'd built together. "You know what I learned from all this?" she said against his shoulder. "Family isn't about blood or legality or making sense on paper. It's about showing up when things get dangerous. It's about choosing each other on purpose, every single day, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. You did that for me first. When you hired a desperate kid with 3 garbage bags, everything else was just me returning the favor." She pulled back, grinning through tears she'd finally let fall. "Besides, old man, someone had to stop you from marrying any more evil syndicate operatives. I couldn't trust you to vet your own dates. Your judgment is clearly terrible." Tony laughed, that full, unguarded laugh that had taken a decade to earn and 4 years of prison to deepen into something richer. He hugged her back, and outside the bakery windows, the city moved on, full of people searching for connection, for family, for someone to choose them when choosing seemed impossible. Inside, 2 formerly lonely people finished closing up shop, argued about tomorrow's menu. Tony wanted to try a new supplier for chocolate. Pamela thought he was being cheap, and headed home together. A father and daughter not by birth or law or any conventional definition, but by something stronger. Choice, courage, and love that had refused to die even when someone literally tried to end it with carefully measured doses of poison disguised as care. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss more stories about family, loyalty, and love that defies every odd. See you in the next one. Thank you.